too often in Web3, it's like cool stuff is being built, but it's because it's cool stuff, right? It's not because it's actually solving a real problem.
Okay, so today I'm happy to welcome back on the show, because it was only a couple of months ago that we spoke, Marieke Flament, who is CEO of Near Foundation. Welcome back, Marieke.
Well, thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, so I mean, it was a great interview we did last time. It ran for just over about half an hour. I'd highly recommend you revisit that if you'd like more context on Marieke, but also her journey as CEO at Near and all the kind of progress that they've made. This episode is going to be much more focused. It's going to center around the fact that I'm happy to say that we are collaborating on a program. So it will be Near and Outlier Ventures Base Camp. We'll revisit some things relative to, I guess, our history and a little bit about Marieke. But again, if you want a deeper dive, go back to the previous episode. And we're going to focus much more around, I guess, this evolved vision for Near, which is away from just being considered a layer one to a blockchain operating system, an OS, and something that if you stretch can kind of take you into this direction of a super app or an app chain for app chains. Had a recent conversation with Ilya, I think, after we had our interview, and he kind of spoke about you could consider Near as a super app, but a super app for super apps that could be replicated. So I think that's a really interesting concept. Obviously, app chains being a big topic of conversation and something that we consider the implications of in our recent paper, Attack on the Open Metaverse and the Fight Back. So maybe just quickly, Marieke, if you could just explain what you do at Near Protocol as CEO, so people can get at least some context before we get into the weeds.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the CEO of the Near Foundation, which purpose it's actually to help the sustainable growth of the ecosystem, which is built around the Near technology. And so what is in the Near technology? There is, of course, like a layer one, which is a proof of stake, very scalable and very cheap and extremely sustainable layer one. But there is also this evolution that you mentioned, which is the evolution in becoming a blockchain operating system. But the role I do is actually as CEO of the Near Foundation is how can we foster the growth of that ecosystem so that all the bits and pieces and the building blocks are in place so that more developers and more builders can come on, more projects can thrive, so that ultimately actually users are using the technology without necessarily having to know what technology they're using, because for users, we just need to solve real life use cases.
Yeah, and you guys are making super traction in the developer community, a number of really exciting apps going mainstream on the network. One of several reasons why, we felt it was the kind of right time now to look at a collaboration, at accelerating that ecosystem. Quick summary for those that don't know, Marieke is a French-born computer engineer, worked all around the world at a diverse group of companies, ranging from LMVH to Boston Consulting Group, Expedia's Hotels.com, and then perhaps more relevant, the kind of crypto giant that is Circle. You are recognized in a number of lists in fintech, in particular Women in Fintech Power List for 2017 and 19. Yeah, you were also CEO of Metal, which I forgot there, which was a kind of a subdivision of NatWest Bank, I think, here in the UK. Right? So really kind of solid background in fintech and much broader than that. So maybe we kind of just pick up back onto this concept, this high level concept of considering Near as more than just a layer one, how if taken to its extreme, you could consider that in the context of a super app or an app chain of app chains. And then we'll get into, I guess, the areas, the kind of 5 pillars I think we've got that form our investment thesis for the accelerator, which of course are inextricably linked to areas, use cases, industries which you think Near is really primed to be able to kind of capitalize on.
Yeah, and actually, maybe to start that conversation, I'll start with a bit of history. So Near started actually as an AI company, and the name Near is actually because singularity is near. That's the origin of Near. And when Alex and Ilya created Near, their vision was imagine actually a super app that can build whatever apps people need in the world. And to do that, they needed to have, freelancers and developers all across the world. And they also needed to pay those freelancers and developers all across the world. And so they had heard at the time of crypto to pay people. And so they started doing that. And they realized very quickly that to do a $200 transaction, it was costing you crazy amount of money. So then they thought, okay, hang on, that actually doesn't work. And turns out micropayments, but being able to pay people at scale for the vision they had for AI was fundamental. So they went back to drawing board and said, okay, pause. We're actually going to have to first look at this blockchain thing and how do we solve that? Because not only is it expensive, but it's also unusable. It's very, very complicated. It's not thought through to actually be very user friendly. So they went back to the drawing board. They interviewed a ton of different protocols. And actually, for those of you who are interested, I encourage you to look at it on YouTube. There is a whiteboard series where they basically interview projects like Solana and Polygon and so on and so forth, and basically dissect to every bits and pieces what is it and how things work. And what they did from that, they took the best pieces and I said, okay, we're going to build a layer one that actually is extremely scalable, super cheap, and super sustainable in its ethos, and very, very usable, right? So by default, you have account naming that are extremely user friendly, and you have a bunch of things that are today starting to be on an Ethereum roadmap, but that have been thought through from the start. So that's the origin. Now, in progressing on that journey, the realization has been a few things. One, actually, being just a layer one is an extremely crowded place, right? When you look at actually the landscape in 2022, I think it's over 150 layer one that exists, and I don't know how many layer twos and so on and so forth. And the other realization is the end user doesn't care, right? Maybe in our crypto la la land, sometimes we care about that, but the reality is that the end user doesn't care. The end user wants something that solves a real problem and that is extremely usable and actually that can do great things. And so Web3 at times is very, very tribalistic, right? So you have this layer one versus that layer one and so on. And what's actually needed is putting all of that together and thinking more from a user perspective, how to bring it all together in something that ultimately is much more multi-chain, is very usable and so on. And hence why we said, okay, if we evolve this concept of layer one into something that's actually much more attuned to an operating system, hence why we call it the blockchain operating system, well, what is it that you need? You need actually components, this ability to go and fork, and this ability as a user to also be true to the Web3 values, which is owning your data and owning your content and being able to port it from that experience to that experience. Hence, this evolution in our story of being from a layer one to actually being this blockchain operating system. Now, if you go to the onnear.org, you can actually start experimenting what that looks like. And so to give an idea of a couple of features that will appeal immediately. One, in terms of login, today the Web3 login has been mostly a wallet, right? And actually it's still not there yet, right? It's still cumbersome, and which wallet do you really trust? And we're still stuck in those login issues. So we've created something that's called fast auth, and it's actually faster as a login than anything in Web2. It's seamless in terms of user experience it gives you, and immediately you can get into Web3, right? So things like that make it immediately appealing. Another thing, for example, would be, okay, imagine a great application that's built on another chain, for example, Ethereum, but you want to bring that with a decentralized front end to bring a new experience for it. Well, you can do that also with the blockchain operating system, right? So it's really about making the vision and the realization of Web3 come together, this idea of portability for users, but also this idea of I can fork and take and match code as a developer, and therefore I can develop way, way faster anything that is out there. Hence why, this concept of super app indeed becomes actually feasible and visible, in particular on Near.
I've now had a flashback to being on a Shanghai terrace. It sounds incredibly glamorous, to be honest with you. A terrace in Shanghai with Ilya talking about Web3 and AI, and very quickly realizing that I should probably shut up because you knew a lot more about it than me. I think I was a few beers in, so I was a bit slow in realizing that this is something I probably should very quickly get onto a different subject. But it's interesting that, in a way, we're kind of coming full circle back to that premise, the premise of convergence, which is something that we've shared with Near for some time. Obviously, you've got a maturing stack, as you said. The kind of goal is or could be that it could be complete in and of itself as a super app. But of course, it's still relatively nascent, like everything else, right? There is no perfect solution which has every element in place. But I think the premise is you've now got these kind of basic building blocks, these primitives that work. They've proven that they work. They've proven that they scale. I saw something just recently flashed past my Twitter feed, which I think Near's the cheapest place to mint NFTs. And so there's like lots of proof points as to why there is going to be increased developer adoption of Near. And so one of the 4 pillars is improving that stack, that operating system by infrastructure, SDKs, middleware. Could you maybe talk through that a little bit?
Yeah, and actually, so exactly your point, right? A lot of it is being built and working construction. Now, the beauty of it is actually coming in and participating and building widgets on this blockchain operating system never has been easier. And we see thousands of it being created. And you can not only create something from scratch new, but you can also take it, copy, paste, fork it, and just tweak it slightly a little bit, right? So that innovation is becoming faster. I think for people also who are interested, we have a community called DevHub who are also continuously listing things that actually would be cool if someone is thinking about that, right? In terms of infrastructure, it would be really, really great if we had, a better way to, search for NFTs or even scale them, because you mentioned it's like the cheapest thing to mint on Near, but that's not enough, right? So there's a ton of ideas on that. So because it's never complete, I think that's important to continue having these building blocks on core infrastructure that enables others to actually bring on more, basically for more volume.
And that's interesting that you've got this developer forum, which is almost like a RFP, request for proposal, right? There are lots of talented technical people out there, or commercial people, and they're looking for the next thing to work on, to build on. And it can be quite daunting sometimes. You've got a blank piece of paper. Well, what do you do? So that could be a really good starting point. You also have a very healthy grants program. I know you do hackathons and stuff like that. I think the difference here is that, look, and hopefully some of the teams that have come through the grants program go on to mature and become startups that we can work with in the accelerator. But there is obviously a difference between a proof of concept in a hackathon and an investable, scalable startup, right? And I think that's the purpose of the accelerator. So you have grants programs to help people in those very, very early stages play around and create a concept. But really here, we're looking at kind of taking those and then turning them into high growth startups.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's also a realization of 2022 is that it is not enough to have just grants, right? Because actually what is needed, even it's not enough to just have hackathon. And one could argue that actually a hackathon are mostly for brand awareness, because the reality is that people go, they have a great time, they might win something, and they created something that's really MVP, but it's not investable, it's not actually usable, none of that. And then the road from this, this is like the 0 to 0.001, but the 0.001 to 1, that's really hard. And that's where we're very excited about our partnership, because having, the hand holding, having actually a place where you can actually ask for advice, having a place where you can actually listen, having a place where you can actually also have others who might be thinking of different things. Like that's the journey that is really needed, because on the internet today and on any, chain, and Near is no stranger to that, you can find almost any documentation you want for anything. You could literally chat to almost anyone you want, but it's not the same thing as being part of, a cohort, a group, like being handheld and being like, because most also entrepreneurs we see, very often we all have like one super ninja skill, right? One or two, but we don't have all ninja skills. And actually having someone who's seen more of it or can have also like this pattern recognition is extremely, extremely valuable. And so therefore, that's also why we're very excited, to your point, to do more than just like the very grassroots, but to help projects become very successful, very fundable, and therefore like great successes. It's a total win-win for us, right?
Yeah, and of course you need all of those things. I think you guys have done a great job of building this wonderful base of developers. And as I said, there's this growing ecosystem of apps, and it's how we now catalyze the wider Web3 ecosystem and capital base around those that have the most promise. Typically in a program, we're accepting anything from 5 to 1% of all applications. So it really is, who are the teams that have the right mix of competency, the right product market fit, that have the most potential to kind of drive that network adoption of Near, or contribute meaningfully to its stack so more developers can kind of be onboarded. I'm going to come back to the AI piece in a little bit, but I just want to kind of talk through this Web 2.5 concept, because I think it's perhaps the more contentious one in a way. We just released this Open Metaverse Under Attack, and one of the considerations or concerns is, could Web 2.5 be permanent rather than transitory? And so it'd be interesting to kind of get your perspective on it, because we absolutely need to abstract complexity away. We need to deliver not just comparable but better experiences for users. But at the same time, that means that founders have to make difficult decisions every day. Maybe you could talk to how Near makes those trade-offs less, being able to truly realize Web3, or at least be on a pathway to realizing Web3, but at the same time, delivering a comparable experience, at least a comparable experience in a Web2 context.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's very often, it is controversial, right? Okay, here's our point of view. The reality is, if you compare the number of users that are in Web 2 versus number of users that are in Web 3, it's like, it's night and day. Like it's billions in Web 2 and it's actually still in the hundreds of millions, fine, but it's still tiny in Web 3. And so to get to ultimately true real adoption, somewhere this transition has to happen, right? And so the question becomes, okay, how does that transition happen? In a way, it reminds me a lot of, when stuff was not digitized yet and businesses were thinking, oh yeah, it's kind of on the side, right? I have like my innovation department, like they're on the side, they're just playing around with tech, and then maybe one day they'll do something. Turns out a couple of years later, like boom, everything is shifted. Here with Web3, it's quite different, because the transition is not that easy, in the sense that the values of Web3, this total openness, having users own their data, can be completely alien to actually a traditional Web2 business, right? And the most success we've actually seen is with businesses who they're almost like perfect fit for Web3. I'll give you an example. Sweatcoin. Sweatcoin is an app, 150 million users, and you get a token, but that token was never Web3. It was like a token, which is just like, it's fictitious. And a lot of their users were actually saying like, when crypto, when Web3, because it's so prime for it. And even for that team, the experience of like, what does it mean to go Web3? It means different channels. It means engaging your community differently. It means becoming open source for a lot of things. And are you comfortable with that, right? So it's not necessarily easy. Another example, Cosmos AI is a business that actually helped bring together buying online and actually buying in real store. And that use case I love, because actually the founder and his team were having problems with their economic business model. And when they were looking at it, they were like, there's no way we're ever making money on that business, because actually what's happening is the fact that Stripe is taking too much percentage of us everywhere. And so they started using actually Near testnet. And then they were like, oh my God, problem solved, right? And they were like, okay, if we can put that in mainnet, then we'll solve it. So I think those use cases are probably the best, right? When there is like and that for me is the tip of the adoption, right? Then same in gaming. I think in gaming, there's some really interesting also use cases that are almost prone for that. But to your point, it's a mindset shift. So the transition is much harder Web 2 to Web 3 than it was traditional retail to digital, right? I think it's like, because it requires you to rethink a lot of things, right? But I think we think it's needed. Like, there is no way Web3 is going to be mass adopted if Web2 doesn't move on to Web3, right? Just mathematically, it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah, and this maybe links into the third of the four pillars, which is real world use cases. You alluded to one there, which is linking on-chain with physical in store. Something we kind of we refer to as de-commerce, perhaps, at Outlier. But so there's always been this promise of like, okay, at the moment, DeFi is kind of like, it's just on-chain games, right? And it's not really materially changing anybody's lives. It's not really a form of financial inclusion. It's for a elite group of web users, a very small percentage of Web3 users, which are already a very small percentage of the global population. And they're kind of just playing these financial games with one another. There's this whole narrative around refi, regenerative finance, which is much more than energy. It's about sustainable, regenerative economic systems. But a big part of that is, well, how do you link all of this stuff, all these financial primitives, these peer-to-peer markets, to real world stuff? So it'd be great to kind of hear a little bit more about how you understand that category.
Yeah, and actually building on what you're saying, I think it goes back to, why does one build a product? You build a product because you want to solve a real problem, right? And I think it's too often in Web3, it's like cool stuff is being built, but because it's cool stuff, right? It's not because it's actually solving a real problem. And so the influx of talent we are seeing over the last 6 to 8 months is thinking totally different. It's thinking, okay, hey, problem, how do I solve? Okay, it turns out Web3 blockchain could be a tool to actually help me solve that problem, right? So I think that's where those things are really interesting. Look, here is what we see. We see a lot of problems to be solved in the loyalty space, right? We hear that over and over from brands. And I think there's so many attempts at like trying to crack that problem, right? So I give something to my users. Do they really own it? Is it really portable? Can I actually also have it with like other brands? How do I do that? How do I engage more my existing users? Can I create a new line of business revenue for me as a business? Like, those are the type of themes that we hear, which I think would fit definitely in the real use cases. I'll take a totally different track, because you talked about refi. But for example, today, okay, we need to do a ton of reforestation. Yes, we need to have like better transparency for carbon credit marketplaces, which, crypto is actually great at that, right? You can say, okay, this carbon credit goes from here to there. This person is buying, like, you can do it. But you can do also other things, which is, what about from the moment the carbon credit is being created, can you actually trace that, have transparency on a chain, right? This idea of like total transparency for assets and things that should be trusted, that's also a real use case. So that's what we mean by real use cases. I think it's thinking back to first principle, which a lot of people will recognize if you've, tipped your toes into building something. You always start, and a pitch to a VC is always the same thing. It's like, here's a problem, mega problem, and here's how we're going to solve it. And I think that's the mindset that we all need more of, because again, I think there's been a lot in Web3 of like, as you said, like, cool things for like farming, for doing this, what that is. Is that solving a real problem? Not sure.
So that's the third of four. So we've covered infrastructure, kind of middleware. We've covered Web 2.5. We've covered real world use case and assets. And then the final one, coming full circle back to this AI piece, is something, given the team's background, and most of them, I think, were at Google and various other big tech firms. So they were inside, well, some of the biggest AI companies on the planet, solving like very meaningful problems and challenges. So I'd imagine that they'd have a very nuanced understanding and approach to Web3 and AI. I know a lot of people are coming into it now in a relatively superficial way. Okay, well, you've got all these widgets, and some of those widgets can allow you to do some generative AI stuff. And that's interesting. I don't want to dismiss that. We do want to see those kind of things apply. But I imagine you've got a more nuanced perspective on AI and Web3 as well.
Two things on that. So actually, Ilya is one of the co-writer of one of the, I think, most cited paper in AI, which is "Attention is All You Need." So that's a good read. And I think we'll make sure we share also in the notes here. Ilya wrote recently a blog post on exactly that, this intersection between AI and blockchain. And you're spot on. We have a more nuanced view, but also a much more pragmatic view. Right? What are the problems of AI that actually could be solved with blockchain? And I'll just, shoot one out there out of many. But for example, we're now approaching very, very fast a world that can be completely DDoSed, right? So the reality is that you can create any content at any speed and it can look very, very true, but actually it's totally fake. And so that's kind of a problem. So, you need to know origin and time creation of it, and actually traceability, back to traceability, right? Traceability of how this come to emerge and where has it been since it's been created. Now, I think blockchain could be a perfect use case for that, right? So, and that's one of many things. And I think it's thinking through those, again, back to like, what's the problem to solve? AI is extremely powerful and can, empower all of us to do better things faster. But equally, there's also some, problems and dangers that probably can actually be solved and at least attuned with AI. So I think we'll put that actually in the show notes, because this blog post of Ilya actually outlines probably some good ideas for people who are thinking, okay, what is this intersection and how could we start thinking about maybe ideas to explore in that field?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way of framing it, in that, look, there's clearly lots of opportunities here, and that's what everyone's focused on, all the new things that they can do. But if you've been working in AI for a while and you have an understanding of Web3, you're going to see first, second order, third order effects of this stuff mainstreaming. So, velocity of information and media is just like one example of that. And again, something you're only going to have if you spent, several decades thinking about the hard problems. You're kind of 10 steps ahead of the pack. So we'll definitely share that in the show notes. As I said, I'd highly recommend, if you want more detail and background on both Marieke and Nia, then go to the previous podcast. We'll put a few things in the show notes, including the reference to both the previous paper by Ilya, but then also this recent thought piece. If you are thinking about applying, go to outlierventures.io/basecamp. I think recruitment's now already live and will run for several weeks. And perhaps the kind of parting comment I'd say you might have something to build on it is, a lot of the time we and our protocol partners are speaking to Web3 developers, because there is a requirement to have a pretty good understanding, technical, theoretical, practical, of Web3 technology to implement an application. I think the potential here is that we're speaking to founders generally. And so you might be an AI founder. You might not identify as a Web3 founder. But here is a stack of technologies that can help you solve for AI problems by leveraging Web3 technology, whilst you're a relative newbie to the space. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I mean, that echoes a lot. Look, there is also JavaScript SDK and a feasibility for anyone to actually participate. So, and back to what we've been talking about, usability, solving real problems. I think it's crucial for Web3 to evolve to also have that new talent coming in. So, it's going to sound cheesy, but whomever you are, you don't need to be Web3 native. I think it's the time now to build and to have like lots of different thought process coming together to actually get to the next stage of all this evolution that is needed for Web3 to really get to mass adoption.
Great. Well, Marieke, thanks for coming on again. Great to catch up and really excited to kick off this program with you.
Same here. Super excited about the partnership. Thank you for having me.